the podcast where we talk about the real stuff, the messy stuff, and occasionally the why didn't anyone tell me about that
hmm
stuff about raising kids. I'm your host Curtis, and always I have my co-host RJ. Hey RJ, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Curtis. Doing good. A little tired, but that's just the state of parenthood, right?
Yep, that's right. Right on. So it never fully goes away, even when you have kids grown up. I hear. Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. Definitely does not, right? Josh called me last week about a parking ticket I got, and somehow it became a 30-minute conversation about whether the parking sign was actually technically clear or not.
Interesting. And how did that resolve?
Listen, he paid the ticket, right? Eventually, we
Yep.
got that out of him.
Cool, cool. So there it is. Okay, so that's actually the perfect little warm up for what we're talking about today. Because today's episode is about consequences, specifically what makes a consequence fair when a tween breaks a rule. And RJ, I gotta say, I feel like you're the exact person for this conversation today.
Well, thanks, Curtis.
Yeah, so you got Josh and Armanda. They're both grown up, both out of the house, and you made it through the tween years with both of them, right? I feel like you've got some war stories to tell us today, perhaps, and the wisdom, which is the best combination.
That's a generous way to describe my parenting career. I'd say I've survived, have the evidence and maybe a few scars, but sure, let's call that wisdom.
Sure, we're gonna call it wisdom, okay? So it's let's set the scene because if you have a tween, and a lot of our listeners probably do, you've heard the phrase "that's so unfair," and approximately 10,000 times a day, no doubt.
At least.
Right on. So that's probably a minimum amount, maybe for some, maybe more for others. And honestly, RJ, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this, is the tween wrong? Like, is it always just a pushback, or are they right? Hmm.
Oh, I think sometimes they're right. That's the honest answer. Kids at that age are actually really tuned in to fairness,
Yep.
right? Like their brains are specifically wired to detect injustice. And sometimes they're detecting something real. The
Yep.
problem is they can also just be embarrassed, right? Or they messed up and they're not ready to admit it. And that's unfair is a lot easier to say than I was wrong.
Yep. So we've got to know the difference, right?
Yeah, we got to know the difference, right? That's exactly it. And that starts with understanding what the consequences actually is,
Yep.
right? Because a lot of us grew up in households where punishment and consequences were treated like the same thing, and truly they're not.
Right. Right. Okay. So let's break that down, RJ. What is the difference? Because I think a lot of parents, myself included, kind of use those words interchangeably.
Yeah, so here's the way I think about it, right? Punishment is basically about making someone feel bad for what they did.
Mhm.
It's kind of like backward looking. It's about the past, and it's often about control. So who's in charge?
Right. That's because I said so. Energy, right?
Right. And look, I get it, right? When we are in a moment and your kid just did something that made you pull out your hair. Because I said so is right there. Because
Yep.
the consequences are different, right? And a consequence flows from behavior. It makes sense.
Mhm.
It's connected and it's forward looking. It's about what the kid can learn and does differently next time.
Right. You want to give me an example, a real one that maybe with your kids you did before?
Sure. So let's say your tween leaves their bike out in the rain, right? And it
Yep.
gets rusty. A punishment would be taking away their video games for a week. What does that have to do with the bike, right?
Nothing.
Nothing. It's just plain, it's just hurting them.
Yep.
But a consequence would be okay, you left your bike out. Now you're going to research how to prevent rust and help fix it the next time.
Hmm.
So you see the difference, right?
Yep. Yeah, that sounds pretty good there, Jay. That one teaches, one just strings it. One just strings it out, right?
Exactly. And tweens, they can smell the difference, right? They really can. When a consequence is logical and connected
Yep.
to what happened, they might still be upset, but somewhere in there, they know they usually know it's fair, right? When it's
Mhm.
completely disconnected, that's when you get the shutdown. The wall goes
Right.
up and nobody learns anything.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think about it as an adult, right? If my boss chewed me out for being 5 minutes late by canceling my project that had nothing to do with being on time, I'd be furious. not just upset, furious. Like the unfairness of it would be all I could focus on.
And that's exactly how your twin would feel, right? Their
Yep.
capacity to feel injustice is huge. And when we hand down consequences that aren't proportional or aren't related, we're pouring gasoline on their fire.
Yep. Okay. So let's talk about the type of consequences because I think there's a useful framework here. You mentioned natural consequences. Can you walk through that?
Yeah, so natural consequences are honestly the most powerful ones, and also the hardest for parents to, or the also the hardest, yeah, for parents to allow. Excuse me.
Yep.
A natural consequence is just what happens when you don't intervene, right? Life does the teaching. We've talked about this in past episodes.
Yep, that's right. So like if they don't do the homework,
Yeah, they go to school unprepared, right? They get called on. They feel embarrassed. They feel
yep,
called out. And I know every parenting instinct is to want us to step in before the moment happens, right? We
yep.
want to save them from embarrassment, but sometimes the embarrassment is the lesson.
Oh yeah. That's a hard one for me personally.
Look, it's hard for everyone, right? Because
Yep.
we love them. We don't want them to hurt. But there's a version of saving them that actually prevents them from growing. If
Yep.
you're always got that helicopter, ready to swoop in, they never figure out how to deal with the landing on their own.
Yep, right on. So let's talk about Armanda there. Has she ever had a moment like that where you just had to, let it play out?
Oh, absolutely. So one that stands out was she's probably like 11 or 12. She had a group
Yep.
project and kept putting it off, right?
Yep.
But and kept telling me it was fine. Don't worry about it. I'll get to it. I could see it wasn't fine, and I made the call not to intervene. I
Hmm.
just watched.
And then what happened?
And she got to school, and her group was not happy with her, right? She came home that afternoon after school, and she was quiet at dinner, which for
Yep.
Amanda, who talks constantly, was very loud, right? If you know what I mean.
Right. Loud silence. Interesting.
Yes, very loud silence, right? And that night she came to me and said, "Look, I should have done my part sooner."
Mm.
No lecture from me necessary, right? Life already gave the lecture way more effectively than I could have.
Right. I love that. So okay. So natural consequences are powerful. So, but let them happen. What about logical consequences where you as the parent are actually stepping in?
Yeah, this one's a difficult one for people to grasp, but logical consequences are the ones you put in place. But the
Yep.
key word is logical. They still have to
Right.
make sense given the behavior. Phone misuse means losing phone time for a bit. Being rude to a sibling means making it genuinely right. A real
Right.
apology, not sorry, from across the room.
Yeah, for sure. The performance story. It's pretty classic.
Yeah,
I've seen it many
right.
times.
Sorry. While still looking at the TV, right? My kids invented that one, I think.
You think so? I don't know. I think it's pretty common for most parents. I'm sure they can relate to that, right? So basically, it's a
Yeah,
universal tween experience right there.
totally, totally. And breaking something carelessly means helping to fix or replace it, right? The
Yep.
logic is always what connects the consequence back to this behavior in a way that teaches something.
Okay, let's talk about proportionality because I think this is where a lot of parents, and I put myself in this category sometimes too, we blow it. Like something happens and we're already tired. We're already at the end of our rope. And the thing is that this thing happens and the consequence is just huge. Why bigger, way bigger than the situation warranted to be?
Yeah, and I've done that one too, right? I'll be honest.
Yeah.
Josh was probably 13, talked back to me in front of company, which
Uh-huh.
for me is a huge thing personally. It's a button that hits really hard. And
Yep.
my response was way out of proportion to what actually happened. I grounded him for 2 weeks.
Oh my God. 2 weeks? Really?
Well, 2 weeks, yeah, for one snarky comment, right? And you know what happened?
I guess he was furious about it.
Absolutely furious. And I was embarrassed too, because when I cooled down and thought about it, I knew it was way too much, right? He knew it was way too much. And I'd spent all that relational capital on something that didn't warrant it.
So what did you do?
Humbly, I walked it back. right?
Right.
Which is also a thing parents need to hear. You're allowed to say, I overcorrected.
Hmm.
I went to Josh and I said, look, I think 2 weeks was too much. I was embarrassed in front of people and I reacted, more than I needed to react to what
Hmm.
you actually did. A week is fair. Let's talk about why it bothered me.
Wow, that takes a lot of guts, but it also shows that you are a stand-up parent and you realize that, hey, maybe this was too much, and then come up to the kid and say, listen, let's change it a little bit, right?
Yeah, it takes a lot of humility, a lot of growth to take that step. But you know what it
Yep.
actually does? It
What's that?
models exactly what you want your kid to do, right? You want them
Yep.
to be able to say, I went too far. Let me recalculate or recalibrate, right? And you get to
Right.
show them what that looks like. Like the GPS in your car. When you go off course, she's always saying, recalculating,
Yep.
recalculating.
Yeah, that's
We can
funny.
do that as parents.
Yep. Yep. Just like the GPS. That's huge because I think so many parents feel like they've spent their time walking around saying something and try to get something back. They've actually lost authority, and then they think that might be a weakness, right? By
No,
pulling
it's
back.
actually the opposite though. It
Hmm.
it it builds way more trust. If you can model that, right? Your kid goes from I can't talk to my parent because they're too rigid
Yep.
to my parent is someone who can actually hear me and listen to me. And that
Yep.
relationship, that trust is what makes everything else work, right? If you
Right
got
on.
someone, a 13, 14-year-old who still actually talks to you about things that matter, that
Yep.
didn't happen by accident, right? That's a relationship that was built, usually on humility on your part.
Yeah, and that's the goal, right? It's not compliance; it's a connection with the kids, right?
And that's the whole game, right? Completely, that's a winner as far as I'm concerned.
Yep, for sure, RJ. So let's get into some real world examples because I know our listeners are probably nodding along and thinking, but what do I actually do when my kid forgets their homework for the third time this month? Or what do I do when they actually break curfew? Let's get practical, RJ, and walk me through some of it. Let's go with the school stuff first.
Okay, school. So homework doesn't get turned in, right?
Yep,
Lean on the natural consequences. The grade, the teacher conversation that already stings, right? When you
yep,
add at home isn't more punishment. It's a system. Sit down
yep.
together and figure out why it keeps happening. Is it
Right.
forgetfulness? Is there no system in place? Is there too much going on with your child's life? Look, we try to fill our kids' calendars, right, to keep them
Yep,
active.
yep,
Are we keeping them too busy? Build the solution together.
yep. That's right. So it'd be like a shared ownership, right?
Yeah, exactly. They design the system. There's way more likely to use it, right?
Yep,
And if they're disrespectful to a teacher, that one needs repair.
yeah, for
Apology
sure.
to the teacher, a conversation at home and about what was going on inside them that led to it. Because there's
Yep,
usually something that's rarely just random blowing up at an adult for no reason.
yep. There usually is a why behind it, right?
Always a why. And getting to the why is more valuable than any punishment you can hand down to them.
Yep. So what about cheating? Because that one feels more serious, I feel.
100%, right? Cheating is more serious. The consequences there is you redo the work.
Hmm.
You don't get credit for the original attempt. And then you have the real conversation about why it happened. Was it pressure? Was it not understanding the material? Was it just laziness? Because of each of those has a different solution. And honestly, sometimes it's a conversation about what shortcuts cost you in the long term.
Yep. That's good stuff there, Jay. So what about home stuff like a curfew? Because I know that's a big one for a lot of families.
The curfew. And we've all set them, we've all had them, we
Yep.
understand them. But a beautiful example of a logical consequence being straightforward. You came home late. Curfew gets old earlier for a period of time. You couldn't make it at 11. Well, let's see if you can make it at 10. Well, and
Yep.
I'm talking for the older ones, right? Or
Hmm.
even if it's 9. Sorry, you couldn't make it by home by 9. Guess what? Now you have to be in by 8 o'clock, right?
Yep.
Here's the important piece. Tell them exactly what they have to do to earn the freedom back. Don't
Right.
leave it vague, right? You've been home on time every week, every day for 3 weeks. We're moving it back to the original curfew.
Right on. So they have some input on the outcome, right?
They have all the input and they're taking control of it themselves. They know the consequence, they
Yep.
can meet the consequence, they know what they do to earn back their freedom.
That's good stuff, RJ. So what about lying? Like they lied about where they were going. So some kids say I'm going here, but they're actually trying to sneak out and see somebody else. What do you feel about that?
That one hits different because it's not just the behavior, right? It's
Right.
the trust.
Right on.
And the consequence there has to reflect that. Some independence gets pulled back because independence isn't built on trust and trust was broken. But again, clear path back.
Hmm.
Here's what rebuilding looks like. Here's how long I need to seek constantly consistent honesty before we get back to where we were. Right?
Right.
You're not punishing them forever. You're just making the trust visible. Here's what you have to do to earn it.
I like that. Making that trust visible is great. Okay, so I want to spend a minute on tween side of this because our audience isn't just parents. Some tweens are also probably listening. Maybe because a parent shared it with them, or maybe they just found it on their own. Who knows, right? And I want to speak to them for a sec, RJ. Can you help me here? Because you've talked about your own kids and this stuff and their stuff. What would you say to a kid who generally feels like they've got an unfair consequence? So,
The first thing I would say is your feeling is real,
yep,
right? Don't let anyone dismiss that. If it feels unfair, that feeling is valid. The question is whether the feeling matches the facts.
right. How do you think they should figure that one out?
Honestly, time is the greatest factor. In the heat of the moment, everything feels catastrophic,
Yep,
right? Give it an hour or until the next day and then ask yourself, did I know this was against the rules? Did
right,
I do it anyway? Does this consequence actually connect to what I did? If you can answer it honestly, you usually know.
right, right. And if they still think it's unfair after that, what do you think they should do?
Look, they have the right to say so, right? Respectfully. No slamming doors, not yelling, I hate you,
Yep.
right? I hear both of those from my house at various times.
Hmm.
And continually asking a conversation, right? Can I talk to you about this when you have a minute? Is one of the most powerful things a tween can say because
Yep.
most parents will say yes to that. They want to hear their kid, they just can't hear them through all the yelling.
Yep. That's such a good point there, RJ. Like the method of asking matters as much as the ask itself, right?
100%. And here's the thing I told both Josh and Amanda as they were growing up.
Yep.
You might do everything right. Stay calm, ask respectfully, make your case clearly, and still not get the outcome you want. And that's part of it too, right? Learning to
Yep.
advocate for yourself with your words and then accept the answer even when it's not what you hoped for. That's a skill that will serve you your entire life. You
All
won't
right.
always get what you want, even though you presented a clear case for it, right? Be prepared for that.
Right on, RJ. So that's good parenting advice disguised as a tween advice as well, correct?
Here's the thing, and that's the secret. It's all the same advice.
Yep. Awesome. Okay, let's talk about something else. I think gets skipped over a lot, which tweens actually have a voice with the rules. Like, are we letting our kids have any say in the expectations that we're holding them to?
That one's so important. And the answer is in most households, it's not enough. Look, kids
Right.
are going to vote on whether they're not going to vote on whether they have to go to school. Some things
Right.
are not up for debate, right? They're rules, hard and steady. And but
Yep.
things like curfews, screen time limits, expectations around chores, how consequences are handled, those can be conversations and like you said, a negotiation or a paired outcome.
Right. So that doesn't undermine your authority, though, right? Like if you're negotiating with your kid.
No, like I said, it's a shared collaboration. I want to push back
Mhm.
on that word negotiating. I
Right.
think of it more like collaborating, right? You're not
Right.
giving
Right.
up authority. You're exercising it thoughtfully. And when I sat down with Josh and said, "What do you think would be a fair curfew?" I still had final say,
Yep.
but I wanted to hear his reasoning. And sometimes his reasoning was actually good. Sometimes he'd say, well, everyone else has until 10 on weekends, right? And I'd say everyone else isn't consideration, it isn't my consideration, right?
Yep.
But sometimes he'd make a point of I hadn't thought of, and you can adjust.
Yeah, for sure, sure. But I do like the collaboration idea there, RJ. That's gonna be great. And what did it do for him when you did that, the collaboration stuff?
Look, listen, when you work it out together, they start following the rules. So that's what he did, right? Because they
Cool.
feel like they're their rules too. You both put them in place, right? When you help build something, you have some ownership into it, right? Same
Right.
principle.
Oh, perfect. Awesome. So, I mean, think about all that work. If your boss just hands down every policy with no input or no explanation versus workplace in the workplace, where would you feel? What would you feel like? Would you feel like your voice was heard, or and how shaping things, or not? Because that'd be a different experience, right? So if you don't have no input, and the boss just says, "Hey, just do this," you feel like whatever, right? You wouldn't feel so good about your work.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the other piece is just make the expectations clear, right? Because one of the
Yep.
reasons teens feel like they've got an unfair consequences is that nobody ever actually stated the rule explicitly, like curfew being
Yep.
around 10 instead of 10 o'clock, door closed behind you. Vagueness isn't kindness. Clarity is kindness.
Right on. So I'll probably should write that down. Clarity is kindness, right? Write that down, guys. So a
Yeah,
good point
everybody
there.
get your pen and papers, right?
Yeah, yeah. All right, RJ, let's bring it home. So for the big picture, what's the thing you want parents to walk away from this episode with?
I think it's this. The goal of a consequence is never to break your kid down. It's to help them grow. And that shift in mindset changes everything,
Hmm.
right? It changes how you respond in the moment, how you explain the consequence, how you
Yep.
circle back afterward. If your internal question is, how do I make this hurt enough that they won't do it again? You're going to
Hmm.
land in punishment territory. If the internal question is, what does my kid need to understand from this experience? You're going to land somewhere with much more useful results.
Right on. And the relationship will still stay intact, right?
Completely, right? You were building bridges, you're building that relationship. And I'll say it again. This is the most important thing because the tween years are they're not your finish line, right?
Exactly.
My kids are grown, but they're still my kids. They still have to lean on us for everything they need, right? The tween years are the training ground. You want your kid to still come to you at 15, 16, 22, 30 with the real stuff.
Yep.
And that only
Yeah.
happens if you've been
Right.
someone they trust through the messy middle.
Right on. And your kids do that today too, right? Even if they're older.
Absolutely. And you want them to still come to you, right?
Yep.
They did, right? They still come to me with the real stuff, and I'm proud of that. Not because I was a perfect parent. I was very much not. I got a lot of things wrong. Don't get me wrong. I'm telling you some good lessons here, but
Yep.
I'm telling you from a learning experience because we kept talking, right? Even when it was
Hmm.
uncomfortable, even when I
Yep.
handled something wrong and I had to come back and say so, we kept talking.
Right on. I love that, RJ. Okay, so rapid fire before we close here. Give me three quick practical things a parent can do this week related to what we're talking about today.
Okay, one, next time you're about to hand down a consequence, pause and ask yourself, does this connect to what actually happened? If
Hmm.
it doesn't, find one that does. Number two, sit down with your tween this week. Not because something went wrong, just proactively. And ask
Right.
them if there are any rules in the house that feel unclear or confusing, right? Just
Right.
listen. You might actually learn something from them.
Cool.
And third, the next time your kid comes to you calmly and respectfully to push back on something, actually hear themselves out. Even if your answer is still no, the act of being heard matters almost as much as the outcome.
All right, that's good, RJ. Those are pretty good rules or key points to talk about. As always, man, that's why we keep bringing you back because you have some great experiences, RJ.
Listen, you keep bringing me back. I'm here every week, right?
Right, right. Oh, it's good. All right, so that's pretty true what we talked about today. So if this episode hit home for you, please let another parent know who's that may need to hear this today. That's how we grow our community. And if you got a topic you want us to cover, let me know in the comments or message me. So if you're wrestling with something, you need some help with your kids, maybe we can help you. Maybe you'd like to become on the show and discuss it with us. We can work it out. We want to hear from you, and that's what the Parent Sport Circle is all about. So if you are watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, and hit the bell so next time we go live, you'll be notified. If you're watching on Facebook, please leave a comment. Love to hear from you guys. So we'll see you next week. Until then, keep talking to your kids, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, right?
especially when it's hard, right? Take care, everybody.
Take care, guys. We'll see you next week. Thanks.